The silent cowboy hunted the woman who betrayed his brother.
I told you what would happen if I saw your face again.
The fire had already died, yet the canyon still carried its memory, as if the flames had only just retreated beneath the surface of the earth. Ash drifted slowly through the twilight air, rising and falling with each restless breath of the desert wind. It settled heavily over the blackened remains of a wooden cabin that had collapsed into quiet ruin. The structure no longer resembled a home, but rather a warning, its charred beams reaching upward like broken fingers, grasping for something already gone. Rowan moved through the wreckage without hesitation. His boots pressed deep into the gray dust, as though he intended to leave a mark meant to outlast the destruction. His gaze remained fixed and unblinking, scanning not for answers, but for confirmation. Somewhere beneath these ashes, he had already accepted the truth he came to find. In his hand, he carried a sheriff's badge. The metal surface was scratched and dulled, permanently stained with dried blood that no amount of time could erase. Yet, he held it with a care bordering on reverence, as though it were the last sacred fragment stripped away from him. His brother had worn that badge. His brother had been a man worth believing in, and now his brother was gone. By the time the canyon opened into a stretch of empty land, the day's last light had begun to fade into a colder, quieter dusk. Rowan was already mounted, resuming the trail without pause. The signs were faint and scattered disturbed sand and broken stems, yet he followed them with absolute certainty. He did not need to question his direction. Revenge had a way of making every path feel inevitable. The abandoned train station stood at the edge of nowhere, half swallowed by time and neglect. Its shattered windows stared out into the dark like hollow eyes that had seen too much and chosen silence over truth. Rowan dismounted slowly, his movements controlled and deliberate. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside, allowing the harsh creak to echo through the empty structure like a warning arriving too late. She was there. Clara stood near the far wall, partially hidden in shadow. Her figure was still, composed in a way that felt unnatural for someone hunted across miles of open wasteland. She did not reach for a weapon. She made no attempt to flee. Instead, she turned her head and met his gaze. Her expression held neither fear nor defiance, only a quiet, unbreakable exhaustion. Rowan had imagined this moment countless times, yet none of those imaginings had prepared him for this total absence of struggle. He raised his revolver anyway. "You took his life for a handful of silver." His voice carried no anger. It carried only judgment, sharpened into something far more dangerous. Clara did not look away. For a brief moment, the silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding. When she finally answered, her voice remained perfectly steady, despite everything that had led them here. "I took his life, so the devil would not take yours." The words settled into the cold space between them, irreversible and absolute. Rowan closed the distance without another word. His movements were swift and practiced as he seized her wrists, binding them tightly with rough rope. He ignored the fact that she offered no resistance. He ignored the way her stillness unsettled him far more than any physical struggle could have. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the fragile remains of the station as though the world itself were trying to interfere. Rowan did not listen. He led her back into the dark, toward the town that waited, toward the rope that would decide her fate, and toward a truth he had not yet begun to understand. Noon offered no mercy, and the desert pressed down on them with a relentless heat that erased all comfort, forcing them forward along a narrow trail carved through dust and stone, where every step carried weight and no rest was promised. Rowan rode in silence, his posture rigid in the saddle, one hand steady on the reins, while the other held the rope that bound Clara's wrists. The rope remained taut between them, a quiet line of control, shifting slightly with every uneven step she took behind him. Clara walked without complaint, though the strain revealed itself in the tightening of her shoulders and the subtle hesitation in her stride whenever the ground turned rough beneath her boots. Dust clung to her skin and clothes, weighing her down, yet she neither asked for mercy nor resisted the path forced upon her. The silence between them was not empty, but filled with everything left unsaid, pressing closer with each passing mile until it felt almost tangible. The sun climbed higher, and the heat settled deeper, draining strength slowly, tightening the air in their lungs until even breathing became a quiet effort. Clara stumbled once, the motion brief but enough to pull the rope forward. Rowan felt it and turned his head slightly, watching her steady herself before she fell. He lingered for a moment, then faced forward again without offering help, as though acknowledgement alone might weaken the boundary between them. Time stretched, marked only by footsteps and the distant whisper of wind across open land. At last, Rowan reached for his canteen, the metal warm beneath his hand. He hesitated briefly, then tossed it back toward her. "Drink," he said, his voice low and controlled. Clara caught it awkwardly with bound hands, her fingers trembling as she raised it. Her lips were cracked, her face drawn with dryness, yet she took only a small sip before lowering it again. Rowan noticed. He said nothing, but his gaze remained on her longer than before. Instead of drinking more, Clara stepped closer to the horse. The animal's breathing had grown heavy, its sides rising and falling under the pressure of heat. She lifted her bound hands carefully, the rope biting into her skin as she tilted the canteen, letting a small amount of water gather in her palm before reaching up to the horse's muzzle. Her movements were slow and deliberate, guided by a quiet gentleness that stood in stark contrast to everything Rowan believed about her. "Easy," she murmured softly. The horse leaned into her touch. Rowan watched in silence, something subtle shifting beneath his thoughts. He had seen men beg for water, fight for it, lose themselves to it, yet he had never seen anyone give it away so willingly. Clara lowered her hands, the last drops gone, and stepped back without explanation. Rowan pulled the reins to a stop, allowing the horse a brief moment of rest. The silence returned, but it no longer felt the same. "Silence does not make you innocent," he said after a while, his voice quieter but steady. Clara lifted her gaze, meeting his despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "And anger does not make you right, Rowan." The words settled heavily between them. Rowan studied her more closely then, noticing the marks on her wrists beneath the fresh wounds, older scars layered beneath them, speaking of something endured long before he had ever found her. He turned away without comment, yet the certainty that had guided him this far no longer felt as solid as it once had. The trail stretched on before them, unchanged and endless, but something within the silence had begun to shift, and neither of them could yet decide whether that change would lead them toward truth or ruin. The purple twilight surrendered quickly to a suffocating darkness as they entered Dead Man's Pass, a narrow, jagged throat of rock where the wind howled through the stone like something alive, carrying a sound that felt too deliberate to be natural. Rowan rode at the front, his eyes scanning the ridges above with quiet intensity, while his hand remained close to the cold steel of his revolver, as though he had already begun to expect trouble before it revealed itself. Behind him, Clara followed on foot, the rope that bound her wrists still tethered to the saddle, forcing her to move in rhythm with the horse. Her steps measured, despite the exhaustion that had settled deep into her body. The first gunshot shattered the silence without warning, the flash of light cutting through the darkness for a split second before vanishing, leaving only the violent echo that ricocheted between the canyon walls. Rowan's horse reared in panic as the bullet grazed its flank, and he reacted instantly, pulling hard on the reins before throwing himself from the saddle and dragging Clara down with him into the dust. "Get down," he shouted, though the command barely carried through the chaos that followed. A second volley erupted almost immediately, bullets striking rock above their heads and sending fragments scattering as figures appeared along the ridge, their movements controlled, their rifles angled downward with the confidence of men who had already decided how this would end. Rowan pulled Clara behind a fallen boulder, positioning himself at the edge as he returned fire with measured precision, each shot deliberate even as the pressure around him began to tighten. The outlaws spread across the ridge, their gunfire relentless, forcing him into a narrowing space where every movement risked exposure. Then, another shot rang out. The bullet struck the saddle horn with a sharp metallic crack, and a jagged fragment broke loose, spinning wildly through the air, before slicing cleanly through the long rope that tethered Clara's bound wrists to the horse. The sudden release pulled her forward, off balance, and she stumbled into the dust as the tension vanished, leaving her hands still tightly bound, but no longer controlled by the animal. Clara froze. Freedom arrived without warning, heavy and disorienting. Behind her stretched the open desert, vast and silent, offering escape without resistance. Ahead of her, Rowan remained locked in the fight, unaware that anything had changed, unaware that a large outlaw had climbed onto the rock behind him, raising a shotgun slowly, carefully, aligning the barrel with Rowan's back. Clara's breath caught. Her chest rose unevenly as fear and urgency collided, her thoughts scattering as she looked from the open darkness behind her to the man in front of her, who was seconds away from dying. She could run. She should run. Instead, she turned. Her gaze dropped to the ground where a fallen revolver lay half buried in dust, thrown loose in the chaos of the fight. She hesitated, her hands still bound, the rope biting into her skin as she lowered herself awkwardly, her fingers struggling to close around the grip without the freedom to move naturally. She was not ready. She fired anyway. The shot cracked through the canyon, sharp and uncontrolled, the recoil jerking her arm as the bullet struck the outlaw just as he began to pull the trigger. The man staggered backward, his shotgun firing harmlessly into the sky before he lost his balance and disappeared from the edge of the rock. The remaining outlaws hesitated, their confidence broken by the sudden shift, and within moments they began to retreat into the darkness, their presence dissolving into the night as quickly as it had appeared. Rowan rose slowly, his chest heaving as he turned, his revolver lifting toward Clara, though his hand no longer held the same certainty. His gaze moved from the fallen body to her trembling figure, to the gun still shaking in her hands. "You were free," he said, his voice rough, strained by both breath and confusion. "The desert was wide open. Why did you not run?" Clara lowered the gun slowly, her hands still unsteady, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity that did not match the fear still lingering in her breath. "Because dying out here is too easy, Rowan." Rowan kept his gun raised longer than necessary, though the certainty that had guided his hand before had already begun to fracture, and when he finally turned away, the motion carried more exhaustion than control. They moved without speaking. The storm found them before night fully settled, a rare desert rain falling without warning, turning the dust beneath their feet into dark, clinging mud while the sky closed in above them. Rowan's steps grew uneven as the pain in his side worsened, the wound he had ignored during the fight demanding its due, and by the time they reached the cave, he could no longer conceal the strain. He faltered once. Clara saw it. She moved without asking, slipping beneath his arm and taking part of his weight despite the rope still binding her wrists, her movements careful but urgent as she guided him into the shelter of the cave. Rowan tried to resist at first, the instinct to push her away still present, but the effort drained what little strength remained, and he allowed himself to be lowered against the cold stone. The rain softened outside, its sound echoing faintly against the cave walls, while darkness pressed in until Clara struck flint against stone, her bound hands working awkwardly until a small flame caught and slowly grew. The fire cast uneven light across the space, revealing the tension in Rowan's face, the pain he could no longer hide. Clara turned toward him. The blood had spread further than she expected, soaking through his shirt, and for a moment her hands hovered, as though touching him would make the danger irreversible. Then she tore her shawl. The sound of fabric ripping cut through the quiet as she pressed the cloth against his side, ignoring the way his body tensed beneath her touch. Rowan reacted instantly, his hand closing around her wrist with sudden force, his grip still strong despite the weakness in his breath. "Do not," he muttered, his voice low and strained. Clara did not pull away. "If I do not, you will not survive the night," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence that followed. Then, slowly, Rowan released her. Not because he trusted her, but because he had no strength left to refuse. Clara pressed harder, her movements deliberate as she worked to slow the bleeding, her fingers brushing against his skin as she bound the wound with what little she had. The closeness between them felt unfamiliar, stripped of violence for the first time, and neither of them knew how to exist within it. Rowan watched her. He searched her face for something that would restore the certainty he had lost, something that would prove she was still the enemy he had believed her to be. Yet all he found was quiet, focus, and a softness that did not belong to a traitor. "You should have run," he said after a long moment, his voice rough, shaped by confusion as much as pain. Clara tightened the cloth, her hands stained with his blood. "Maybe," she said quietly. "But you did not." She lifted her gaze, meeting his. "No." The word settled between them, simple and unyielding. Rowan held her eyes, and something within him shifted in a way he could not control, something that pressed against the anger he had carried this far. "You have your brother's eyes," Clara said softly, her voice careful now. Rowan's jaw tightened. "Do not," he warned. But Clara did not stop. "But he never looked at me with mercy." The fire flickered, casting light across her face as the words settled into the space between them, and for the first time since this began, Rowan felt something unfamiliar rise within him, something that did not belong to vengeance. It felt like doubt. And beneath it, something even more dangerous. The beginning of wanting to protect her. The rain finally stopped. The sudden silence was heavier than the storm. Inside the cave, only the dying embers of the fire remained, hissing softly as stray drops of water fell from the stone ceiling. Rowan opened his eyes. The fever had broken, leaving him weak, hollowed out, and painfully awake. Clara was still sitting across from him. Her face was pale in the dim light, her eyes fixed on the ashes. Rowan watched her. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. "Tell me," he said. His voice was raw, scraping against the quiet. Clara did not move. "Tell me what happened that night." She slowly raised her head. The firelight caught the glint of tears she had refused to shed all day. "You do not want to know the truth, Rowan. I have chased you across a desert for it. I have bled for it. Tell me." Clara let out a shaky breath. She looked down at her wrists, at the faded scars hiding beneath the new, raw burns. "You thought he was a hero," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "The whole town thought he was a saint wearing a silver star. But saints do not come home smelling of cheap whiskey and blood." Rowan gripped the rock beneath him. "He protected that town." "He owned that town," Clara corrected quietly. and he gambled it away. Every dollar, every favor, he owed the very men who tried to kill us in the past tonight. Rowan shook his head, a desperate denial. No, Jesse was a lawman. He fought them. He worked with them, Rowan, until the debt grew too large, until they demanded a price he could not pay with stolen silver. She looked directly at him now. The absolute certainty in her eyes made his stomach turn cold. They wanted blood. They wanted a trophy. They wanted the famous deputy who had been causing them so much trouble. Rowan stopped breathing. They wanted you. That is a lie, Rowan hissed, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. Clara's voice trembled, breaking under the weight of the memory. You came home drunk that night, or maybe he drugged your glass. You passed out at the table. He told me to pack a bag. He told me he had made a deal. His life for yours. Rowan stared at her. His mind raced, clawing for a defense, for a memory that would prove her wrong. But instead, other memories surfaced. The strange men who visited their house at midnight, the missing funds from the sheriff's lockbox. The way Jesse would change the subject whenever Rowan asked too many questions. And the bruises. The bruises on Clara's arms that Rowan had seen at the dinner table but chose to ignore, believing his brother's lies about her being clumsy. He had chosen to be blind. I could not let him do it, Clara whispered, a single tear finally spilling over her cheek. I could not let him hand you over to be tortured. So I rode to the next county. I brought the federal marshals. You brought the law to his door, Rowan breathed. I brought them to stop the trade. He drew his weapon first. They fired back. Rowan pressed his hand against his bleeding side, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the agony tearing through his chest. Why did you run? Rowan asked, his voice breaking. Why did you not tell the town? Who would have believed the sheriff's mistress? Clara asked bitterly. He was their hero. You were his loyal brother. I was just the traitor. She leaned forward, the firelight illuminating the absolute despair in her expression. He did not die a hero, Rowan. He died trying to sell you. I just made sure he paid the price instead of you. The words echoed in the damp cave. They shattered the last remaining pieces of Rowan's world. He slowly reached into his pocket with trembling fingers. He pulled out the silver star, stained with his brother's blood. It was not a symbol of justice anymore. It was a badge of his own willful ignorance. He had protected a monster, and he had hunted the only person who had ever truly tried to save him. Rowan let the star slip from his fingers. It fell into the dirt with a dull, hollow thud. Neither of them spoke again. They did not need to. The silence was no longer a weapon between them. It was a grave. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of crimson and bruised purple. Against the dying light, a single horse cast a long, weary silhouette across the desert floor. Rowan and Clara rode into town. The air was stifling, thick with heat and the smell of impending violence. Dust choked the empty streets, swirling around the wooden porches like ghosts. Men stood in the shadows of the saloon, their hands hovering near their gun belts. Women pulled their children inside, behind locked doors. They all recognized the woman on the back of the horse. They had already built the gallows. Rowan pulled the reins, bringing the exhausted horse to a halt in front of the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller stepped out onto the porch. He was a large man with a cold smile, a man who used to drink whiskey at Jesse's table. He was the new law in town, but Rowan now knew he was just another wolf hiding behind a tin badge. Half a dozen deputies fanned out behind him. They were the same men who ran the smuggling routes with his brother. They held their rifles loosely, but their eyes were sharp. "You caught the viper," Miller called out, his voice echoing in the dead silence. Rowan did not answer. He felt Clara stiffen behind him. She knew these men. She knew they were not here to serve justice. They were here to silence her before she could expose the town's rotting core. "Bring her down, Rowan," Miller commanded, his smile fading into something harder. "The judge signed the order this morning. We will hang her before nightfall." Rowan slowly dismounted. His boots hit the dust with a heavy thud. His wounded side burned fiercely with every movement, but his mind had never been clearer. He looked at the men standing on the porch. He looked at the town that had praised his monstrous brother and condemned an innocent woman. Miller stepped off the porch, extending a hand to take the prisoner. "Hand her over, boy. She is a traitor." Rowan did not hand her over. Instead, he reached down to his belt. His hand closed around the bone handle of his hunting knife. The deputies immediately raised their rifles. The metallic clicks echoed through the empty street. "Rowan," Miller warned, his hand dropping to his revolver, "do not do anything foolish." Rowan ignored him. He turned his back to the guns. He looked up at Clara. Her wrists were covered in dried blood and raw burns. She looked back at him, her eyes wide, uncertain of what he was about to do. Rowan reached up. With one swift, sharp motion, he sliced the heavy hemp rope. The thick cord fell into the dust. Clara gasped, rubbing her freed, bleeding wrists. A collective murmur of shock rippled through the gathered crowd hiding in the shadows. Miller's face turned scarlet with rage. "What in God's name are you doing?" Miller shouted. "She murdered your brother." Rowan turned back to face the sheriff. He reached out and pulled his Winchester rifle from the saddle scabbard. The smooth, deliberate motion sent a wave of panic through the corrupt deputies. Rowan racked the lever of the rifle. The heavy brass shell slid into the chamber with a sharp, mechanical sound that demanded absolute silence. He leveled the barrel directly at Miller's chest. "The only traitor died 2 months ago." His voice was calm. It did not shake. It carried the absolute certainty of a man who had finally found the truth. "And I am done paying his debts." The wind howled through the center of the town, blowing the dust across the standoff. There was no turning back now. The street emptied quickly. Only drifting smoke and the sharp scent of gunpowder remained as the last echoes of gunfire faded. The town held its breath. Rowan fired until there was nothing left. The empty click of his rifle was louder than any gunshot. He did not hesitate. Rowan threw the weapon aside and surged forward. He slammed into Sheriff Miller before the massive man could raise his gun, his fist striking with brutal force. But Miller absorbed the blow. With a vicious snarl, the sheriff grabbed Rowan and drove him backward, slamming him down into the muddy street. The air left Rowan's lungs in a sharp, broken gasp. Miller pinned him down. His heavy knee crushed Rowan's wounded side. Rowan fought fiercely, slipping in the dirt and blood, but the sheriff's sheer size overpowered him. Miller reached for his belt. The hunting knife came free. The jagged steel caught the fading light as it rose high above Rowan's chest. Rowan struggled wildly, but he had no leverage left. The blade was coming down. Clara saw everything. The noise of the world vanished. A dropped revolver lay in the dirt near her boots. She lunged for it. Her fingers slipped on the cold iron before gripping it tight. The weight of the gun paralyzed her. The terrifying memory of Jesse's violence crushed her chest. Her hands shook violently. Her vision blurred with panic. Miller's muscles tensed to strike. "Stop!" Clara screamed, her voice breaking. Miller did not look up. The knife descended. Clara pulled the trigger. Bang! The shot cracked like thunder. The heavy recoil jerked her arms back. Then, the street went dead silent. Rowan violently arched his back in the mud. A sharp, agonizing groan tore from his throat. The bullet had missed the sheriff. It had torn straight into Rowan's shoulder. Clara froze. The revolver slipped from her trembling hands, hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. She had shot the man trying to save her. Miller stopped. The sudden gunshot and the spray of Rowan's blood froze the sheriff in shock for a fraction of a second. That single hesitation was his last. With a primal, desperate roar, Rowan pushed through the blinding agony. He grabbed his own fallen blade from the mud and drove it brutally upward. The steel sank deep into Miller's chest. The massive sheriff stiffened, his eyes wide with disbelief, before collapsing heavily into the dirt. Dead. Absolute silence returned to the smoky street. Clara dropped to her knees. She scrambled frantically through the mud, falling beside Rowan. Her bruised hands desperately pressed against the fresh, bleeding wound she had just given him. "I am sorry," she gasped, her voice breaking into uncontrollable sobs. "Oh God, I am so sorry. I did not mean to." Rowan lay in the mud, his breathing dangerously shallow. His face was deathly pale, but as he looked up at her tear-streaked face, the cold hardness of the hunter finally vanished. He reached out with a trembling, blood-stained hand and gently covered hers. "It is all right, Clara," he whispered, forcing a fragile, weary smile. "My debts are finally paid." A week passed. Rowan slowly recovered, and throughout those days, Clara never left his side. Dawn settled quietly over the train station, wrapping the platform in pale mist. Rowan stood near a wooden post, his shoulder bound in fresh bandages showing faint traces of blood. His posture was steady but worn, held together by habit rather than strength. Clara stood nearby, a small suitcase at her feet. Her gaze was lowered, the weight of the past pressing against her in a silence heavier than words. The memory of the gunshot lingered in every breath she took. Rowan spoke without looking at her. "You should go," he said, his voice calm but distant. The train whistle cut through the morning air, sharp and final. Steam rolled across the platform, and the grinding of metal against the tracks signaled a slow, inevitable pull. "I bought you a ticket," Rowan continued, adjusting his hat to hide the strain in his eyes. "There is nothing left here but ghosts. You deserve a cleaner start." Clara did not answer. She picked up her suitcase, stepping toward the train and climbing aboard without looking back. It was the only way she could force herself to leave. Rowan turned away before the train moved, facing the empty desert, his shoulders tensed beneath the heavy silence. As the wheels turned and the train gathered distance, his iron control finally fractured. He closed his eyes and lowered his head. Then he heard his name. "Rowan." The voice was soft but certain. He turned. Clara stood on the mist-covered platform, her suitcase set down. The train moved past her, fading into the distance as though she no longer belonged to it. They looked at each other in a silence, filled with everything that had changed. "Why haven't you left?" Rowan asked, his voice unsteady. Clara stepped closer. "I cannot leave when my heart remains here." The words settled gently between them. For the first time, Rowan allowed himself a faint, real smile. The train disappeared into the horizon, leaving them with an uncertain future, but one finally worth staying for. Some love stories are not about finding peace, but about choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. Rowan and Clara did not escape their past. They faced it together, carrying scars that would never fully fade. If this story stayed with you, then there are many more waiting to be told. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more cinematic tales of love, betrayal, and redemption in the unforgiving West, and step into stories where every choice comes with a cost, and every heart must decide what it is willing to fight for.